Hello everyone, my name is Aloan. I am 20 years old and currently reside in a joyful household with my dad and stepmom, and I also have a sibling whom my stepmom brought into our home. His name is Caden. Our life is generally content. Although I have a new family and my dad remarried, I didn't dwell on it much. Everything proceeded smoothly at that time, even though we had just united and become a family. My stepmom and Caden both cherish me greatly. They always assisted me and conversed with each other, which made me feel very joyful and warm. I believed we would have a tranquil life like that. Every morning, the entire family had breakfast together. My stepmom prepared the meal, and my dad always sat next to me, inquiring about the little things in life. Caden never made me feel odd. He was always considerate, helping me with everything from studying to small tasks in the household, even though we had just started living together. I truly felt loved, and there was nothing to fret about. We even watched movies together, chatted together, and everything was delightful. I couldn't think of anything else but those peaceful moments. My dad was a solemn man but loved his family dearly, and my stepmom, although new, always cared for me as if she were my biological mother. Caden was the same. He treated me very kindly, and there was nothing to worry about. Life went on smoothly like that, and I believed that we would always be happy. One day, I began to realize that something was amiss, a peculiar change that I couldn't immediately explain. It was a small thing, but it left me with a lingering feeling that day. I went to the bathroom as usual without thinking much, but in my haste, I forgot to lock the bathroom door, as usual not for the first time. I thought I could rest assured because I was the only one in the house while I was taking a shower. I suddenly heard the bathroom door open slightly. I was startled and quickly turned around, but not before the door opened wider, and I saw Caden standing there. His eyes at that moment were no longer the kind, close eyes as before. They were cold and strange, as if he had just witnessed something wrong or as if he didn't know what to do with himself. He quickly turned away, but a second before he was gone, I saw in his eyes a look of awkwardness and confusion at that moment. I didn't understand what was happening. I just felt like I was stuck in an inexplicable moment. I hurriedly finished my work and got out of the bathroom, but the strange feeling didn't go away. I kept asking myself if I had done something wrong or if there was something between me and him that had changed that I hadn't noticed. After that day, things began to change so gradually that I couldn't immediately notice. At first, those changes seemed so small, so subtle that I thought I was just being overly sensitive. Caden was the same as always, but there seemed to be something different in his eyes every time he looked at me. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thinking that maybe I was imagining things, but then I began to feel this change more clearly when he looked at me. His eyes no longer had the kindness and closeness like before. I couldn't say exactly what was different, but there was a strange feeling as if he was looking at me not as his sister anymore. His eyes swept over me, no longer affectionate, no longer the warm gaze that I was familiar with. Instead, it seemed to be suppressed, something both strange and difficult to understand. Sometimes he even looked at me strangely, as if he was trying to control something that I couldn't understand. At first, I just thought it was because I was too sensitive. Maybe I was imagining it all, but after a few interactions, those strange feelings were no longer imagination. The way he looked at me began to become clearer. He didn't look at me like before, no longer the warm gaze of an older brother for his younger sister. Instead, there were times when his eyes became strange, as if he was hiding something or as if he was facing an emotion that I couldn't explain. Not only did his eyes change, but his actions also began to change. He talked to me less. Before, we used to talk frequently, sharing everything from trivial things to serious stories, but now our conversations have become brief, even sparse. When I try to start a conversation, he only answers vaguely and then goes silent, as if he is trying to avoid me, especially when we sit down to eat together. I clearly feel an invisible wall gradually being built between us. He no longer took the initiative to sit next to me, no longer laughed and joked like before. Everything became tense, like a strange atmosphere was surrounding us. I thought it would just be a short while, then everything would pass and return to its original state, but no, that night everything changed completely. That night, When my parents were away, I felt an unnamed anxiety rising in my heart. The whole house was quiet. Only Caden and I were left. It was a night when everything seemed to be different. I sat in my room, trying to solve a problem that I couldn't understand. In fact, I had been trying to do it all afternoon, but got nowhere. At that moment, all I could think about was asking my brother. I didn't want to bother him because there was a vague distance between us that I couldn't explain, but it was a problem I couldn't solve myself, and I had no other choice. I stood up, worried, wondering if Caden would be as willing to help me as he had been before. Every time I thought of him, I felt a certain distance, as if he was trying to avoid me, but I decided to go out and go to his room. The feeling of confusion made me want to go back, but I knew that if I didn't ask him, I wouldn't be able to solve the problem. Taking a deep breath, I knocked on his door. Enter, Caden's voice echoed from within. I gulped and pushed the door open, stepping inside with somewhat heavy steps. He glanced up at me from his desk, his eyes suddenly becoming peculiar, no longer holding their usual kindness and warmth. However, he showed no discomfort and merely asked a straightforward question. What seems to be the issue? I pursed my lips, hesitated briefly, then explained my reason. I have a math problem I can't comprehend. Could you assist me? He nodded, gestured for me to take a seat, and then began to instruct, but throughout the process, something made me feel uneasy. He spoke very clearly, but occasionally I noticed his eyes darting away, as if attempting to avoid me. Although he patiently explained each step, the atmosphere in the room abruptly turned tense and chilly. I realized that the closeness we once had was gone. Every time he touched the paper or pointed to a part of the problem, I felt an invisible distance, as if he was trying not to get too close to me. When he finally finished helping me with the problem, I was about to stand up and return to my room when suddenly, my hand was grasped. I was startled and looked up at him. Caden held my hand firmly, his eyes no longer cold, but filled with an unusual resolve. We gazed at each other for a moment, neither of us speaking. My feelings at that moment were hard to describe. My heart raced, and I felt like an invisible wall was gradually crumbling between us. Caden, I called his name softly, my voice choked. I stood there, my heart pounding, my eyes unable to look away from his hand that was tightly holding mine. Caden looked at me with a cold seriousness, but his eyes were filled with a determination I had never seen before. Not the gaze of a brother looking at his sister, but the gaze of someone trying to convince me to do something I couldn't understand. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me as if he was contemplating something important. I felt my heart tighten, fear rising little by little, as if I was standing at a crossroads with no way out. Everything in the small room suddenly became suffocating and heavy. Finally, after a long silence, Caden spoke softly, but very seriously. Aloan, I have feelings for you. I can't continue to pretend like everything is normal. I want you to stay with me. I want us to be together. I stood there, unable to believe what I had just heard. Those words, the words my brother had uttered, couldn't possibly be true. I wanted to say something, but my throat was choked, unable to utter a word. In that moment, all the memories of him, of my family, of our love suddenly shattered. The feeling of dizziness made me unable to move. I could only stand still, looking at him as if I was in a nightmare from which I could not wake up. Caden continued, his voice low, as if sharing something deep, something I couldn't imagine. Aloan, every night since the night I saw you bathing, I can't stop thinking about you. I know I shouldn't, but I can't stop. I can't stop thinking about you like this. You don't understand, but I want you to stay with me forever. His words were like a slap in the face, snapping me out of my daze. I looked into his eyes, feeling no love, only coldness and strangeness. I wanted to scream, to run away from this room, but my limbs felt like they were nailed to the ground. My brother, the man I loved and trusted, was saying these words, trying to push away the fear that was rising in me. I exhaled, using all my strength to say, No, Caden, this can't be happening. No, you can't say such things. I tried to pull my hand away from his, but He held it tighter, his eyes darkening as if he couldn't accept my refusal. He remained adamant. You don't understand, Aloan. I want you to stay with me. I can't live without you. I felt like I was suffocating, unable to breathe from the tension in the room. It felt like I was trapped in a situation from which I couldn't escape. Everything around me seemed to lose clarity, and the only sound was my frantic heartbeat. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the fear in my heart, and again I spoke louder, more firmly. Brother, stop. This is not happening. You can't do this to me, never. Suddenly, as if in shock, he let go of my hand, looking at me in shock as if he had just realized something terrible. I'm sorry, Aloan, he said softly, his voice weak. I didn't mean to scare you like that. I said nothing, just stood there, feeling all the strength drained from me. My heart was in turmoil. I just wanted to get out of this room as quickly as possible, but before I turned to leave, I couldn't help but say one more time, you need to get help, Caden. This isn't normal. I can't stay if this keeps up. He stood still, saying nothing more. I turned around, found my way quickly out of the room, and slammed the door shut. My mind was filled with unanswered questions, and the confusion made it impossible for me to stop thinking about what had just happened. I quickly locked the door to my room, sat down, and held my head, feeling like everything was collapsing around me. How could this happen? How did everything become like this? The questions kept spinning in my head, but there were no answers. I just sat there in the dark room, alone, scared and helpless. From that day on, everything changed, and I felt it clearly. The relationship between Caden and me was no longer the same, even though we still lived together under the same roof. The closeness, the comfortable conversations, the evenings spent eating together were gone. Instead, there was a vague, heavy distance, like an invisible curtain covering us. After that incident, I didn't dare to look him in the eye anymore. Every time we met, I felt like I was standing on a cliff. Just a slight wind could make me fall down. He no longer took the initiative to talk to me, nor did he ask me questions like before. I even felt that his eyes, when looking at me, had a strangeness, like he was looking at someone I couldn't understand. Day by day, I didn't know what to do to restore this relationship. I still tried to avoid him, as if hoping that time would heal everything, but the more I avoided him, the more I realized that everything was gradually cracking. There was no chance to go back to the way it was before. He never said sorry after everything ended, never once shared or explained. His silence was like a big wound getting deeper and deeper in my heart. There was a part of me that still hoped that everything was just a nightmare, but the more I lived with that silence, the more I realized that we were becoming strangers to each other, like two completely different people. Every time I tried to talk to him, he would just give me a vague answer and then go silent. The stories of the past now became empty spaces that could not be filled. My stepmother had no idea about the changes in my relationship with Caden. She still thought that we simply did not talk to each other for a while, as if it were a normal family affair. There were times when she would ask me sincerely, with a worried look on her face, "Are you too angry with each other? Why don't you talk or have fun like before?" I could only laugh it off, saying that it was nothing, just a small matter, but inside I felt choked up because I knew very well that there was no such thing as a small matter. Every time she asked, I had to force myself to smile, pretending that everything was fine. I didn't want her to know the truth, because I couldn't explain it. I also didn't know how to tell my stepmother that things had changed, that the relationship between Caden and me could never go back to the way it was. Every time she tried to push us to talk, I could only nod or answer vaguely, as if everything was normal, but no matter how hard I tried, I knew deep down that things were no longer the same. Caden's eyes, when looking at me, became increasingly distant, and the silence between us created an irreparable distance. As for my stepmother, even though I didn't know what was going on, I could feel the anxiety in her every question. She didn't understand, but I knew no matter how hard I tried to hide it, things between us had changed too much. Every time I looked at my stepmother, I felt like I was deceiving her because I couldn't share the truth. She still treated me like a daughter, but in my heart, the insecurity and fear grew even more. Everything became more difficult when I couldn't say what I felt and couldn't go back to the peaceful days of the past. Caden and I were broken, and I knew even if I wanted to, we could never go back to the way things were. Are you excessively upset with each other? Why don't you converse or enjoy yourselves like before? I could only dismiss it with laughter, asserting it was trivial, just a minor issue. But internally, I felt stifled because I knew full well that there was no such thing as a minor matter. Each time she inquired, I had to compel myself to grin, feigning that everything was all right. I didn't wish for her to learn the truth because I couldn't elucidate it. Additionally, I was clueless about how to inform my stepmother that circumstances had altered, that the bond between Caden and me could never revert to its former state. Whenever she attempted to urge us to communicate, I could only assent or respond ambiguously, as if everything was typical. Yet, regardless of how arduously I tried, I was aware, deep down, that matters were no longer identical. Caden's gaze, when directed at me, grew increasingly aloof, and the muteness between us forged an insurmountable chasm. Concerning my stepmother, although I was unaware of the specifics, I could sense the trepidation in her every query. She failed to comprehend, but I recognized that no matter how diligently I strove to conceal it, the dynamics between us had transformed excessively. Each time I observed my stepmother, I felt as though I was misleading her because I couldn't divulge the truth. She continued to regard me as a daughter, but within my heart, the uncertainty and dread intensified. Everything became more arduous when I couldn't express my sentiments and couldn't revert to the tranquil days of yesteryears. Caden and I were fractured, and I understood that even if I desired it, we could never return to our former selves. Ultimately, I grasped that unspoken words gradually erode relationships, not due to a lack of desire, but because reticence and dissimulation generate imperceptible schisms that cannot be bridged. Everything within my family has shifted, not solely because of particular deeds, but due to the asphyxiating silence Caden and I fostered. Occasionally, not articulating thoughts exacerbates situations. We all aspire to maintain our family's contentment, but when sentiments are not mutual and anguish remains unaddressed, we cannot revert to our former harmony. I am uncertain how prolonged it will require for me to surmount this transformation, but one certainty is that I cannot persist in a household characterized solely by obscurity and apprehension. I must acquire the skill to confront my emotions and communicate candidly. I cannot perpetually conceal or endure under the pretense that all is well. Our cherished ones may occasionally inflict suffering, but if these issues are not promptly addressed, healing becomes unattainable. The most profound insight I derived from this narrative is to never permit muteness and trepidation to dictate a life of torment. Emotions will not dissipate if we refrain from confronting them. Acknowledging, discussing, and resolving them is invariably the optimal course, despite the occasional anguish and challenges. Only when we embrace reality and endure the discomfort can we genuinely mend the injuries within our souls. Existence and affiliations are not invariably flawless. Every family and individual encounter instance of disorientation and sentiments that cannot be instantly conveyed. However, if we remain silent and evade confrontation, we shall eternally dwell in dread and suffering. Do not allow taciturnity to annihilate the affection between you and your cherished ones. Be valiant in confronting and rectifying errors. Fear must not impede the revelation of veracity, for truth facilitates the reconstruction of bonds, irrespective of the agony endured. Recollect that our resolve to recuperate renders us not only our personal champions, but also the heroes of our surroundings. Thank you for experiencing a Lowen's Chronicle. If you deem this account captivating and poignant, do not neglect to endorse and disseminate it for universal awareness. The narrative concludes herein. I anticipate our reunion in subsequent segments. May your day be splendid.